Good afternoon, everyone. Please take your seats so we could start. Now we will start with the agenda item 11, emissions of HFC 23, potential changes to reporting form 3 for reporting on HFC 23. In paragraph 3 of decision 35-7 on emissions of HFC 23, the Secretariat was requested to provide options for consideration by the parties with respect to potential changes to reporting form 3, specifically concerning when HFC 23 is generated, destroyed, or maintained as stocks. The Secretariat has prepared document 46/3, which is available on the meeting portal, presenting two options for the potential changes to data form 3. Before I open the floor for discussion on this item, I will invite the Secretariat to present the document. I will then give parties the opportunity to ask any question, and after that, open the floor for discussion. So now I would like to give the floor to Secretariat to present.
Thank you, Madam Co-Chair. As you mentioned, the issue is potential changes to Form 3. The document is 46/3, and the decision is paragraph 3 of decision 35-7. And I want to read out the specific directive to the Secretariat, which is to develop options for potential changes to data form 3 concerning when HFC 23 is generated, destroyed, or maintained as stocks. So at the Secretariat, when we started, first we took recognition of the fact that stocks are not required to be reported under Article 7. And secondly, stock levels are not part of the compliance regime. That means they are not included in the calculation of either controlled production or consumption. Then we went further and made one assumption. We assumed that this request was to allow the parties to have some form of monitoring or tracking or accounting for HFC 23 generation or production. And with that assumption, then the other following factor came in was that this would then relate only to new substances. That is, substances that have not been used previously, they are not recovered or anything. And so with that, on that basis, the approach we took was to develop a kind of an accounting framework, very similar to what is done with essential users and critical users. Additionally, as we were reviewing what we needed to do, we did some consultations with some parties. And in that process, a separate issue emerged that there could have been different understandings between the different parties on how to deal with that production, with production of HFC 23. And so in our documentation, we included an extra proposal which was to include a clarification in any modification that might take place of the data form 3. And that clarification would state that amount captured for all users, and that's column 3 of data form 3, that amount should refer to both intentional production and unintentional byproduction. And so after that, then we propose essentially two options. But the two options are actually identical in terms of the information that would be reported if any of them were to be adopted. The information would be identical, but how it might be presented in the reporting forms is what would be different. And so with that, then, we can look first at option 2, and that was the option where we proposed possibly adding an annex to data form 3. What you see on the slides highlighted in golden color or yellow, the columns would represent the new information that as parties you would need to report if you were to adopt this. Actually, when I say parties, we mean primarily producing parties. And so the first column relates to reporting stock at the start of the year, the amount held in stocks or in storage at the beginning of the year. And then what is currently labeled as column E, that is the fourth column, would be quantity used as feedstock. And then the column labeled F, which is the sixth column, parties would report quantity destroyed. And column G would be quantities used in other applications within the country. The idea is parties could report on all users as a single number. That means feedstocks could be combined with other users, but we thought because of the special attention the parties have been paying to feedstocks, and so that's why we separated out feedstock, and then other users that are not feedstock would be reported separately. And then the last column would be the stocks at the end of the year. So with this, then there would be a sense of flow in terms of accounting for what might have been held at the beginning of the year, what might be produced during the year, what might be used during the year, and what might remain at the end of the year. But to fill in some of those gaps, that's why we included some 3 additional columns. They are in green in what you have in the slides. And the 3 columns represent columns that would be filled with information that's actually already being reported in other forms. So the second column, column B, would be quantities imported of HFC 23. The third column would be quantities exported, and so that would come from data form 2. The quantities imported would come from data form 1. And the total amount produced, or the total generation that is captured, would come from column 3 of the production data form 3. So the green columns represent information that would simply be getting transferred from other parts of the data reporting forms to help complete the accounting framework that this would sort of represent. And then associated with that annex would be a footnote, just to clarify what I said about separating out feedstocks from the other users and avoiding double counting the two. So we are presenting the option 2 first because we thought it would be easier to explain. And then option 1 now, you have the same reporting information, the same information being reported or being proposed, but now instead of it being a separate annex, it takes the current existing row for reporting of HFC 23 information in data form 3, and it splits out an extra sub-row within it, similar to the way we do reporting for QPS, methyl bromide use of methyl bromide QPS production. And so there would be a small sub-row just within the same bigger row for HFC23. And then you'd have the same information as in the previous form, which would be stocks on hand at the beginning of the year, quantities used as feedstocks, quantity destroyed, quantity used for other applications within the country, and the final row would be stocks at the beginning of the year. Now, just to clarify a few aspects, if we look at the row proposed as quantity used as feedstock, it would seem to match with the title above, which also talks of feedstocks. But the difference between the two is that production for feedstock effectively represents production intended for feedstock. What is proposed for reporting would be actual uses for feedstock, because if you are tracking stock, then you want to exclude what has been used. And so that's the subtle difference between the two. And the same applies to other users within the country. It should be actual use. So it shouldn't represent something either produced for, it should be something actually used. Now, because we say to account fully, you must also include what you bring into the country and what goes out of the country and so on. So associated with this form, then we have the footnotes. These footnotes fill in for the 3 columns we mentioned for the previous form that were in green. And the 3 columns would be clarifying that to get your full accounting columns in place, the quantity of HFC23 imported would be derived from column 3 of data form 1, and the quantity exported would be found in data form 2, column 3, and quantities produced, or in the case of HFC23, we call it quantity generated and captured, it would come from column 3 of data form 3. So these footnotes match with what was green columns in the previous option. And then finally, of course, we've included the footnote that we are proposing to add that we just clarify amounts produced of HFC23 refers to both intentional production and unintentional byproduction. Thank you.
Thank you, Gerald, for your presentation. And now I will open the floor for question and answer session. And after that, we will have substantive discussion on this agenda item. So on my list, I have Congo and India. Congo, you have the floor. Congo, are you asking the floor? If not, then...
C'était une fausse manœuvre.
No, it was a mistake.
Okay, thank you. So in that case, I will give the floor to India.
Thank you, Madam Co-Chair. We would like to thank the Ozone Secretariat for presenting the data Form 3 along with 2 options in line with Para 3 of Decision 35/7. Madam Co-Chair, the issue needs more discussion to have better clarity of reporting of HFC23, particularly relating to opening and closing stocks. Accordingly, we propose further discussion on this issue either in a contact group. Thank you, Madam Co-Chair.
Thank you. And now I'll give the floor to the United States.
Thank you, Madam Co-Chair. And just, Ian, you can just nod to tell me. I think the way you opened this discussion was to say first questions of clarity and then discussion. Thank you for nodding. So understanding that correctly, I do have a couple quick questions for the Secretariat, and I appreciate that they put together this paper. As we understand the 2 options, I think they are actually the same option presented in 2 different ways and not actually necessarily 2 very different options. We did have a couple quick questions for clarity. The options, and I think that is in line with the decision, were limited to Form 3, but we would like to ask the Secretariat if they've thought about the ramifications, relationship between Form 3, Form 4, which is the form on destruction, and Form 6, which is the form that does concern the reporting on emissions of HFC 23. And if they have considered the relationship between those three forms, is there any insight they can give us? Would be one question, or maybe two, because one is, did they consider it? And two is, do they have insight? And then a separate related question would be, we understand that the way that the Secretariat looked at this was to think about it as an accounting framework. We'd like the Secretary to clarify that that is actually different than other, or at least our view, and the Secretary can agree or disagree. We think that's different than all of the other reporting under Article 7, and that an accounting framework is really only pertinent with regards to the accounting frameworks that are submitted as part of a CUE or an EUE. So we would just like clarity that this would be, changing the reporting under Article 7 to no longer be consistent with what we see in other Article 7 reporting, and to instead align it with something that seems to be more aligned with what we see with an essential use or a critical use nomination. Those are the two questions we have for clarity. We do have some thoughts for discussion, Madam Co-Chair, when you turn to that part of the agenda. Thank you.
Thank you. And now I give the floor to EU.
Thank you, Madam Co-Chair. Thanks a lot for the Ozone Secretariat for preparing these two options for us in updating the reporting sheets in line with the decision of the parties where we asked them to do so. We just have two quick questions of clarifications, and I think at least one of them you may have just answered in the table, but just to be doubly sure. So you do expect reporting not only of R23 generated by the party, but also stocks and feedstock use of imported virgin R23 to be reported. That would be one question. And the second question is if you expect reporting on captured R23 only, or also of uncaptured gases from own production and generation and their feedstock use and destruction. Thank you.
Thank you, and I do not have any other party requesting for the floor, so I will close the list as well and then give Gerald to respond. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Co-Chair, and thank you for the questions. On the issue of whether we considered ramifications and the effects on the other forms and the linkages, that is the forms on destruction and the forms on reporting of HF3 emissions, we actually did. And not only that, as you will recall, we already said that we did consult with other parties around. And actually it did come to our attention that there were certain possible issues, especially arising from the instructions or guidelines provided either in the data forms themselves or the separate document that actually provides guidance and instructions to the parties. In the document itself, we did keep it pretty narrow, and we limited ourselves to the request in the decision. So the only new thing we introduced, we were relatively cautious, was just to say that as we consulted the parties, we realized even just the basic reporting of production, there might have been different understandings between the parties, and so we thought we could add that. But yes, we did come across other issues. And so actually we did even come across explicit possible errors in the instructions or the footnotes associated with the data reporting forms. And so if we were to be bolder, then we might want to correct many of those as well. But we didn't go into that ourselves in the document. I'm hoping that's good enough or clear enough for the USA, and in case it's not, then hopefully they can come back. For the EU, the 5 columns that we have would be the new information that would be reported. But before even I continue, I want to explain. It's not the Secretariat's expectation. It is really the Secretariat trying to put in possible columns of what the parties might choose to report if they wanted to track the stocks, as put in the request to the Secretariat. So we are trying to anticipate what you think you might want to report in order to allow yourselves to track how much is produced, how is it used, not so much how is it used, but what is used and what remains at the end of the year. So this is our attempt to propose to you some of the pieces of data you might consider including in the data forms. But specifically on the question about imports, ideally imports are already supposed to be reported in data form 1. And so we are flagging or pointing out that in the whole accounting process of what you have at the end of the year, you would factor in what you imported, and then you would factor in what you used. And then that way, what you remain at the end is what you didn't use. So it wouldn't be a new reporting obligation. It's already there in the reporting of imports under data form 1. Similarly, what is captured, what is produced, is already supposed to be reported in data form 3 on production. So again, it would not be new reporting. And specifically to the question of whether we would expect parties to report uncaptured, no, we would not. And you are not going to find it in the new forms that are, well, the new columns that we are putting in place. Feedstocks, again, they're supposed to be reported in data form 3 in the corresponding column. So it would not be new reporting. The only new reporting is mostly the stocks, what you use. And if I go to destruction, again, destruction is already supposed to be reported in data form 4. Now, I need to explain the destruction component. The reason we included the destruction component in the new columns is that the destruction that is reported in data form 4 is allowed to include both new substances and recovered substances. But in tracking what is produced year on year, you would want to be tracking only new production. And so what we would report in the new column for destruction would be destruction of newly produced or unused non-recovered substances. And so that's the small difference between the destruction that you would report in this accounting process and what you previously report in data form 4. And now that I've said that, I remember one question from the US that I actually haven't answered. And the idea was how we consider this vis-a-vis accounting for critical use exemptions and accounting for essential use exemptions. All we did is to borrow the concept from those two accounting frameworks, but indeed they are different. And going further, just to clarify again, based on what US asked, all these obligations, and I think we did mention it at the opening, all these newly proposed columns would all be additional and separate and different from the reporting required under Article 7. So presumably, if we were to go by your normal practice, you would normally put all those as optional forms of reporting. Thank you.
Thank you, Gerald. And since I do not have any other party requesting for the floor for EU, you would like to come in?
Yes, and sorry for coming back, and thanks for the explanations already. But potentially on the captured and uncaptured, potentially you could have production of a substance, byproduction, whatever, that is not previously captured but used as a feedstock. So would you that expect to be reported as feedstock use, or would you not, without previous capture? That's what our question is, and it's similar for destruction. Thank you.
Thank you, EU. And Gerald?
Thank you. Actually, that's quite a technical question. And it's not so much what we, the Secretariat, might expect, but I think at the discussions at the time when these forms were being adopted by the parties, I think the parties themselves actually agreed that generation that is not captured and that is used inline in a system, and therefore presumably there would be no emissions, I think the parties agreed that they wouldn't report neither the production nor the feedstock use. But separately, as a party, if you do report the production and report the feedstock use, then that would still be okay, because the idea is to have a certain sense of consistency. So I think that's what I might want to comment, and I think the same applies to the destruction. If I recall well, at the time when the forms were adapted, and it's probably captured in the data forms, in the instructions and in the guidelines, it was agreed amounts that are not captured, that don't get out of a system, if it's generated and then within the same system without getting out is used for feedstock and therefore nothing gets out, then the party didn't have to report that. And we thought that is still consistent because in, out, nothing getting to the atmosphere or nothing getting out of the system, then presumably it's a consistent way of treating the generated amount. But should a party wish to report, then they would need to report both the production and the feedstock use. And actually, it did come to our attention that there are situations in which something is produced, it is not captured, but it is directly applied to some use. And so in such a case, then, for consistency, the party would need to report the production, and then depending on what happens to the substance after the use, if there are part of it is destroyed or part of it is used for other things like feedstock, then they would report that separately. So actually at the Secretariat, as you know, we might not be experts on that, but usually we hope parties will be faithful to the objectives of the protocol and so on. Thank you.
Thank you, Gerald. And I have on my list now US. Yes, you have the floor.
Thank you, and I'll keep it brief because I know we're still on questions. It's just a bit of a follow-up to make sure I'm not sure if I heard the direct answer to one parts of my question before, which is Article 7 is not, traditionally has not been the same as the accounting frameworks. And I just want to make sure I understand, because when we think of stocks in the context of an accounting framework for a CUE or an EUE, it has a different meaning than what I have understood from the Secretariat and from the paper to mean here. So I think if you can provide clarity on what is meant by stocks, that would be very helpful, because stocks to us is quite different than I think the way it is framed here, which is really not about stocks, but it's about the amount that was captured and is pending destruction, which is different. And that would be like an online production of chemical where you have something, as opposed to what we traditionally think of as stocks. So if you could just provide clarity on that one point, that would help us make sure we understood the answer to our earlier question correctly. Thank you.
Thank you, US. And I give the floor to Secretariat to respond.
Thank you, Madam Co-Chair, and thank you again, US, for the opportunity to clarify a little bit more. Actually, I do want to agree with you that this is different. And I think the reason it's different is that in the accounting frameworks for critical users and essential uses, the parties are accounting for the exemptions that they got, and therefore usually not so much about what they are holding in storage. Whereas in this case, based on the request that we got, there was an explicit mention of stocks, and our understanding of stocks is what is in storage. And so, in that sense, then, we were, and based on, because we picked this based on the discussions that took place at the last meeting. And at the last meeting, I remember there was that sense of what is at the beginning of the year in storage, which is what we're calling stocks. And then, while there was no extra detail, then we just told you that our assumption was to allow tracking of that stock or that storage. And so it's on the basis of that assumption. And like we stated, we do agree that all this reporting is all separate, different from Article 7 reporting. So it is actually additional and so on. I'm hoping that's a little bit clearer. Thank you.
Thank you, Gerald. And with this, we will start the substantive discussion on this agenda item. And I open the floor for your interventions and statements. Who would like to start first? United States, you have the floor.
Thank you. And I believe earlier in India's intervention, they actually suggested a small group, and we would support that. We think this is a complicated matter. We do think the Secretariat noted in their response to one of our questions that while the original decision last year and the response was limited to Form 3, they did note that this does have implications for the 3 relevant forms. And it's really only about one chemical, but it is how that chemical is reported on 3 different forms. And I think the Secretariat noted as well that there may in fact even be some errors in the instructions that we as parties might want to correct. So we would strongly support a small group that includes the Secretariat and interested parties. I say small, obviously be open to everyone, but we think that just based on the interventions, this may be a topic for which there's a limited number of parties that are interested, but we'll leave that in your hands to figure that out. And we would certainly want to participate in any discussion on this. Thank you.
Thank you, US. And no other parties requesting the floor. And let me consult with my co-chair on a way forward on this issue. Thank you. Canada, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Co-Chair. You may have gone a little bit too fast for us. We didn't have any questions because I think, like as others have said, it's a complex issue to go over in the plenary, but just a few observations. You know, we want to thank the Secretariat, first of all, for responding to the request from Decision 35/7, which, in our view, was perhaps not completely clear. It says to provide options for consideration by the parties with respect to potential changes to reporting Form 3, specifically concerning when HFC 23 is generated, destroyed, or maintained as stocks. So I think with that guidance, the Secretariat interpreted that parties would want a reporting framework where stocks of HFC 23 would be tracked. And I think that they, you know, with that in mind, what they're suggesting, you know, actually makes sense and, you know, is you know, appears logical. I guess our view is that we're not sure what would be the added value of keeping tracks of these stocks. We don't have a strong recollection of, you know, why this was proposed under Decision 35/7. But in that decision, we were trying to address issues related to the discrepancy between bottom-up and top-down measurements of emissions of HFC 23. And in that sense, we could say that keeping track of when stocks are used could provide a little bit of information, but in general, the amount of HFC 23 that is used and emitted, from year to year is small compared to the amount that's actually generated and then either captured or destroyed. In addition, under this reporting framework, we would only get information from the producing countries, but there could be use and emissions also in countries that import HFC 23. So it wouldn't necessarily help us a lot, we think, but perhaps we're missing something here. So the parties that were a proponent of this particular decision may have some ideas of that. But just to say, we appreciate the work of the Secretariat. We're not sure how much we need, if we need to go into that level of detail, especially since, as has been mentioned by the Secretariat, this is not a requirement under Article 7, and only parties that receive critical or essential use exemptions are required to report separately on stocks under accounting framework. That said, it's really, we want to hear more also about the producing parties to see to what extent this works for us. I think for us, as long as the understanding is, this is a reporting framework that would apply only to parties that actually produce or produce HFC 23 and don't import HFC 23, such as ourselves. We don't have a strong objection. We just want to make sure that whatever is agreed makes the most sense. We also think that if there is a small group that's set up to discuss this, it would be useful indeed to discuss the relationship with data form 6, especially because I think that's where perhaps some of this information was requested perhaps to get a better handle of when HFC 23 by production may or may not be emitted, but we think that has a close relationship to the information that's reported under Form 6, and if we're going to possibly review some of the reporting under Form 3, we may want to see how this affects also the reporting under Form 6. So. And just to indicate our interest in participating in a small group as well on this issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Canada. Thank you, everyone. So the way forward, co-chair suggests that we have an informal group for those who are interested to discuss this issue further. And we will inform the time and the venue later, and maybe on the screen as well. With this, I would like to hand over to my co-chair. And I'm really sorry to do so, to give the task to my co-chair, because as you know, as we speak now, the Netherlands is playing. So.
Thank you. It's indeed the case, so, but let's focus now on agenda item 12. Proposal of Cuba on additional funding to support countries affected by COVID-19. So parties will recall that we had a decision at MOP 35, decision 35/16 on addressing the impact of COVID-19 on the HFC baseline consumption for certain parties. In that decision, it's clearly stated that IMCOM will defer from non-compliance until 2026. Data are available, and that countries that are listed in that annex are encouraged to send in their KIPs and submit its KIPs at the MLF as soon as possible. The Secretariat received a draft decision from Cuba. And that's, I would like now to give Cuba the floor to introduce their proposed decision. And it is in the document 46/2 at 2. So it's in the addendum to the note of the Secretariat. Cuba, you have the floor.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente. Realmente.
Thank you very much, Mr. Co-Chair. You have summarized, you have presented a fine summary. You mentioned the decision adopted during the last meeting of parties, which established a moratorium for a period of 2 years. And in December, we presented a team. The team was adopted. The KIP was adopted, and today we are anticipating liaising with UNDP to begin to implement the plan. As I see on the screen, we have managed, we have information for 2023 related to consumption levels. And this surpassed our forecasts. Among the major concerns which we had was the following: what would happen if imports were to go back down to the pre-pandemic levels. During the 35th meeting of parties, we presented a proposal with objectives. The objective was to allow countries to select their best years for baseline years. This did not happen. And we had 2020, 2021, 2022 preserved. And the decision 3516 states that Cuba is a country that was severely affected by the consequences of the pandemic. As you see on the screen, you have the gray line, that is our baseline. The black line is after a 10% reduction from the gray line, and the red line surpassed the that level, the import levels, our import levels for years predating the pandemic. So what is the reality? The reality tells us for Cuba, once again, even though there are a number of countries concerned, Cuba nonetheless needs to reduce its consumption by 32%. 10% in addition to reach the black line, 40% reduction overall. So I will be concise. What we are proposing with this draft proposal is a request for the multilateral fund through the conference of the meeting of parties to establish a financing window to help us. Because as we know, the KEEP is not enough. The funds associated with the KEEP are limited, and we have seen this being the case over the course of a number of years. Furthermore, in the next 2 years, so we will not have to present applications for the committee. Nonetheless, this is not sufficient to allow us to achieve a 10% reduction in HFC's productions in line with the Kigali Amendment. That is not sufficient. So what we are requesting is for there to be other means, other channels or avenues available. And we turn to the Secretariat to ask what are our options. What is being and what is in this proposal is a request for the meeting of parties to task the multilateral fund with finding financing, with securing the necessary financing. Of course, we need to estimate And to calculate the necessary levels of financing, these need to be very specific calculations to allow us to honor our obligations under the Kigali Agreement, namely a 10% reduction in the HFC consumption level. We have some proposals. We have proposals to put on the table, but we wish to know the extent to which we will enjoy support when it comes to implementation. So in sectors where we have to consume HFCs, this plan needs to be implemented. And as I mentioned, the HFC reduction will be significant for us. Once again, these are just a few avenues which I wish to share with you. This is a proposal which we have in mind, because as I mentioned, the reality is that we need to have not a 10%, but a 42% reduction in HFCs. As you can see on the table on the screen, to achieve this, we need your support. We need the support of parties, and through the meeting of parties, we request that the Multilateral Fund be tasked with delivering financial support to us so that we can attain this noble cause, namely reduction in HFC consumption. Thank you.
Thank you, Cuba, by presenting your proposal. And then I would like to ask parties to take the floor and react on the proposal and or ask questions. So, and I have Grenada on my list.
Thank you very much, Mr. Co-Chair, and thank you very much to the distinguished colleague from Cuba for presenting the proposal and the case for Cuba. Mr. Co-Chair, I would like to be the first to throw my full support behind the delegate from Cuba's proposal in light of the circumstances that are currently faced by Cuba. And I'm saying that on the basis that whereas the case has been made for Cuba, it is not only Cuba who is suffering the same fate and consequences. The curve that is on the screen here for Cuba is identical in shape to the curve for Grenada, in the sense that in 2023, our consumption data for HFCs is above 250% times what the 2022 numbers were. And that is a cause for concern. Inherently, I can see the countries who are faced with the same situation facing a major challenge of maintaining compliance to the Montreal Protocol. So whereas Cuba would have indicated that some direction can be given to the Multilateral Fund to secure some additional financing opportunities to assist countries who are in that same position with meeting their phase-down targets by 2029. I would also like to suggest that in addition to identifying financial opportunities, that some other measures be looked at to see how assistance can be provided to countries to ensure that they stay within compliance to the protocol. The real concern is that as we speak, more and more HFC-type equipment are being installed in our markets. And so that creates a further dependence for HFC refrigerants. We have to be very mindful that we do not disrupt the cooling sector in our countries by adhering very strictly to our quota requirements and restrictions that we have on these imports in the name of meeting our Montreal Protocol targets. Because all of these have implications for economic development, for healthy lifestyles of our people, and we have to be mindful of that. So I would like to support Cuba's proposal here and to be part of the further discussion and conversation. And again, to be part of the Multilateral Fund Executive Committee discussions. And I just want to add that at the Executive Committee level, a list of countries have been identified for further considerations in regard to this particular issue. And my country has been left out of that list. But again, I want to reiterate that the curve that is on the screen is identical in shape to the curve of Cuba, and so we feel that we should be included on that list. However, we will take that up further at the Executive Committee level, But I just wanted to make that representation here that in addition to Cuba, there are several other countries that might be faced with the same situation. And so this August body should really look to see what level of assistance, financial and otherwise, that can be provided to these countries to ensure that we meet our compliance targets, and even more importantly, that our cooling sectors are not disrupted in trying to meet the Montreal Protocol targets. Thank you very much, Mr. Co-Chair.
Thank you. And then I have on my list Sri Lanka and then St. Lucia. Please, Sri Lanka.
Okay, thank you very much, Co-Chair. Now, Sri Lanka is facing same situation as Cuba and Grenada. As a Group 1 Article 5 country, I must bring to your attention the challenges we are facing in implementing the recent economic recession has had a severe impact across various sectors of Sri Lankan economy. We are grappling with the unsustainable debt and severe balance of payment crisis. Our economy contracted by 7.8% in 2022 and by 7.9% in first half of 2023. In response to these economic challenges, the Sri Lankan government made a policy decision to suspend issuing letters of credit LCs from commercial banks for imports, with exception only for fuel, medicine and essential food items, and stop the payment of foreign debt except the multilateral agencies. This measure was aimed at curtailing the outflow of foreign currency reserves. Consequently, refrigerant importers were unable to import the required amounts of refrigerants through the local banking system. The economic recession has caused significant disruption in the import of refrigerants, RAC equipment and materials for service in 2022 and 2023. During this critical period, Sri Lanka was navigating two significant paths: the HCFC phase out and simultaneously preparing for the HFC phase down under the Kigali Amendment. During the baseline formation period, the consumption of HFCs from 2020 to 2021 increased by about 27% and remain at a similar level in 2022, with slight increase of 1.4 from 2021 to 2022. In 2023, the import of HFC was recorded at 708 metric tons, marking an increase of roughly 38.2% compared to 2022. The real specific HFC demand of the government of Sri Lanka was negatively affected by the economic crisis in 2022 and 2023, which slowed down economic activity in the country. However, the cooling demand remained high from the second half of 2023 as the government gradually relaxed restriction on the imports of refrigerators and equipments. Notably, some entrepreneurs started manufacturing or assembling commercial and industrial refrigeration equipment locally to meet the demand and produce inhaler for medical purposes. This development has led to increased HFC refrigerant consumption, evidenced by 38% rise in HFC imports compared to 2022. Despite this growth, the approved baseline for HFC consumption in Sri Lanka is 1.17 million carbon dioxide equivalent tons as per the Montreal Protocol obligation. Sri Lanka has initiated the quota distribution for the HFC in 2024. After analyzing application from 37 refrigerant importers who applied for registration to obtain HFC import quotas, the government of Sri Lanka observed that the demand of HFC in 2024 is extremely high, nearly 5 times the baseline value. This situation underscores a critical issue. The fixed baseline for HFC consumption set 1.17 million carbon dioxide equivalent tons according to the Montreal Protocol obligation does not accurately reflect the actual demand due to recent economic crisis. Addressing this discrepancy is crucial for managing the HFC demand in the country. Under the IMF program, Sri Lanka signed an agreement last month on debt restructuring with Paris Club and friendly countries. So economy is in recovery stage. Rapid growth of cooling sector will be expected. In this context, it is clear that the baseline consumption data for HFC established in use in 2022 consumption level does not adequately reflect the increased demand. Based on importers' tentative demand for 2024 further highlights that demand for HFC exceeds 5 times in the approved baseline quantity. This discrepancy suggests that the current approved baseline is insufficient to meet the actual consumption demand, placing significant pressure on the servicing sector and the impact in the growing demand for manufacturing cooling equipment. To address this issue, we would like to collaborate with Ozone Secretariat and party countries to exchange of knowledge, guidance, technology, and best practices. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I have on my list St. Lucia, Barbados. St. Lucia.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. So we would first like to thank the parties for their assistance, having first received the deferral. And like Cuba, our 2023 consumption surpasses our baseline. And our current 2024 data shows that as of April 2024, we're at 70% of our baseline. With regards to this proposal, we do believe that it's possible that countries who experience lower consumption during these COVID years could have probably been in a different funding category, though it may not be the amounts outlined in the proposal. However, we would be interested in taking part in discussions on these proposals, as we do think that we are in need of further assistance to meet our targets. And like Grenada, we would be interested in what other measures can be taken to assist us in this issue. Thank you.
Then I have Barbados, and please indicate if you would like to speak. So Barbados, please.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. Good afternoon, everyone. First, I would like to thank the proponents of the draft proposal, Cuba, for their submission. And I would like to start by saying that I support the intervention made by the distinguished delegate from Grenada. So I won't go over some of the things that he said in the interest of time. But just to say that as part of the discussions during the contact group, we were opposed to the years that were used for the assessment, but nevertheless, we decided to be flexible in considering that there were other parties that were being affected, possibly more than us, but all parties in the discussions were being affected by COVID-19. We did see a decline in our imports during the base years, which is the years that we wanted to be considered. But what I will say that even though the recommendation was that we could address these issues in KIPS, and while we acknowledge that while we are preparing KIPS and so on, we do have the issue of accessibility and availability to the leapfrog technology, which we prefer, which would be the hydrocarbons, which would help ease the situation in relation to the equipment. So as we speak, we do have an influx of HFC equipment on island, as many other delegations could attest to. And so it is an issue in relation to our HFC meeting the quota allocations and the baselines for our countries. So this particular proposal would warrant further discussion, and I would propose that we do allow parties to have further discussions in whatever group the co-chairs deem appropriate. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbados. I don't have anyone on my list, so are there parties who would like to react or speak on this? Please indicate that. I see, and please, I see now Canada, but also others who would like to speak. Please indicate that. So I have Canada and the United States, please. Canada.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair, and let me first of all thank Cuba for its proposal. We know just from procedurally, we're not sure if there's an actual CRP for us to consider at this meeting, or if it's a proposal that was sent just to the Secretariat. But, you know, because we haven't seen a CRP actually being posted. I think that we're sympathetic to the concerns that have been raised by Cuba and by others. We're not sure what is needed in order to address these issues. We know that, at least in the case of Cuba, for the years 2024 and 2025, there is no concern, at least in terms of compliance, because it is covered by decision 3516, under which a determination of compliance will be deferred, and that's the case at least for a few countries. That decision doesn't prevent a party asking the MOP to consider the possibility of deferring compliance after 2025 if there continues to be a problem. It doesn't also prevent other parties that would like to apply to be covered by this decision to suggest it. But in terms of reopening the levels of funding that were negotiated by the Executive Committee of the Multilateral Fund, we find that this would be somewhat of a poor precedent. These levels of funding for the servicing sector were agreed less than a year ago, and many of these issues were discussed during that time, and this is partly why there was, in comparison with HPMPs, an increase of funding that was provided. And there were also other windows of funding that are available for countries. So just in the case of Cuba, for instance, in addition to the approval of its KIP, there's a decision that indicates that Cuba is allowed on an exceptional basis to submit investment projects in the refrigeration and air conditioning sector to achieve additional HFC reductions. So perhaps there is room there for Cuba within what has been agreed within the Executive Committee to prepare and submit projects in a relatively timely manner that would help the country achieve reductions. So we'd like to discuss these issues with Cuba and others, because we do think that there are perhaps ways of securing funding which have not been completely explored by all countries. And as I mentioned, there are also possible ways of looking at decision 3516 that we took last year and seeing if there are other countries perhaps that could qualify from a deferral of compliance. I think it's a little bit hard to make a judgment call based on data that we have received for 2023. We know that in our case, in the year before the freeze, there was a significant jump in consumption that was due that resulted from stockpiling. So we need to have, really a better understanding of what the long-term trend and what the real demand is in countries, which is, in the current situation, very difficult to get, because our trends are influenced by years during which economies were affected because of COVID. So I think that until we have a better idea of what the actual demand is, countries that have compliance deferral for the next 2 years, do not have an overarching concern, at least in terms of complying with the Montreal Protocol, and can take time to understand what other opportunities there are under the fund for seeking funding. until they get a better idea of what their actual consumption trends are. So that said, we're always interested in having a discussion and see if there's ways in which that could be helpful, not only for Cuba but for other countries. But just to say that, there was a lot of discussions, negotiations among countries with respect at least to the guidelines for countries to receive funding for the servicing sector to achieve a 10% reduction. And it's a little bit, unfortunate that, so soon after having approved them, we wouldn't want to open that. And I'm not saying, perhaps that is not what is being requested here. We're not sure exactly what is being requested. But we would be very reluctant to reopen those discussions. Thank you.
Thank you. Just also on your question, let's say the decision was already sent to the Secretariat at the end of March, and Cuba then requested that it would be considered at this OEWG, and the COP will be soon uploaded, so as a COP 8. Just this for a clarification. Then I would like to give the floor to the United States, Australia, and then I have the EU. United States, please.
Thank you, Co-Chair. Just to say thanks for that procedural clarification. We too were somewhat unsure of the procedural status of that decision, as well as how the agenda item itself came to be put on the agenda, which was done very late in the process, as we recall. That's why it was originally listed, I believe, as 10 bis, if I remember it correctly. But just sticking to the procedural aspects, so our understanding is that if there are pieces of information that countries wish to share or present to the parties, that the normal process is that they are included in information notes that are circulated to the parties rather than projected on the screen during the meeting. So procedurally, it's not an issue we want to resolve now, but I think our preference for the future, we would note for the Secretariat, would be to have that, and there's a reason for that. It's so we as parties can spend some time looking at that ahead of the meeting. Now, moving into the substance, just to say, we are, listen, as we noted last year and the year before, we have some sympathy to the challenges that some countries have outlined that they are facing. We talked a lot about it last year, and I think where we come at this issue is from a starting point of being informed by the actual data and information that we have that lays out precisely what that challenge is. But because we understood there was a challenge, we adopted Decision 3516. So there is a 2-year compliance deferral that is included in that decision to reflect some of these challenges, noting at the same time that for the 8 countries listed, that there's an indication that they will continue to make every effort to comply with the control measures. We had a significant discussion at the time of adoption of this decision about finance-related issues. And the result of that was the language that you see in paragraph 2 of Decision 3516, which urges those 8 parties listed in the annex that have not already done so to submit expeditiously their respective Kigali HFC implementation plans. And to us, this is really a core important aspect of this decision. So our understanding in providing the 2-year compliance deferral was that, in fact, the solution to this problem was to get moving forward as quickly as possible with the Kigali implementation plans. That's the agreed approach in the Executive Committee to begin providing financial assistance to Article 5 countries to deal with both the freeze and the first reduction step, with the first reduction step not being implemented until 2029. So at this point, of the 8 countries, we have received for consideration and adopted 3 of those Kigali implementation plans. My understanding is that in the business plans, in the multilateral fund, that an additional 4 of those countries are targeted to have Kigali implementation plans coming in over the next year or 2. So to us, that is the path forward to try to find resolution to this issue. It's important for a number of reasons, but I'll just highlight 2 that pertain directly to some of the points that have been raised. The first is that in implementation plans or the plans under the Executive Committee for various types of controlled substances, one of the elements that is often included are policy measures. So if countries can move forward with some of these policy measures, including imposing controls on imported equipment, it's going to help reduce the consumption down the line that's needed for servicing of that equipment. And we would find those types of activities to be quite consistent with the language we talked about, saying we will continue, those countries will continue to make every effort to comply with these control measures. Similarly, our understanding is that all of these countries in 3516 and all other parties, frankly, have an obligation to put in a licensing system. And it is through the licensing system and quota systems in countries that compliance is assured. So the KIPs can actually help tremendously with both of these, policy measures, licensing systems. I would just note for the record, the chart that was put forward by Cuba doesn't look entirely dissimilar. It looks in some ways quite similar to a consumption chart for the United States. So in 2021, prior to us having put any controls in place domestically, our consumption was over 450 million metric tons CO2 equivalent. The year prior, almost a 50% increase year over year. We were a little bit over 300. And then in 2022, we were down around 250. That's when a licensing system was put in place. So absent a licensing system, absent any controls being put in place, it's not entirely surprising that you're seeing consumption levels that are above your baseline. Now, listen, every country's baseline is different. We know that for the Article 5 countries. Cuba's case in particular, Cuba doesn't get a whole lot of help from the HCFC component of the baseline. Some other countries have a very large component, so they're not tight at all on their baseline. We do understand Cuba is quite tight for that reason, and that's why we took decision 3516. So from our perspective, again, partly sympathetic to the case. We don't think just because your consumption the year before your first compliance obligation, stockpiling is quite common. We've also seen that in other KIP proposals from certain Article 5 countries, a spike just before you impose your quota and licensing system. But what we've tried to do is to hear these concerns and find remedies. The remedy is in 3516. There's an agreement there. 2-year compliance deferral. If you're taking the 2-year compliance deferral, you say you will make your utmost efforts to comply and that you will move forward with your KIP. I want to highlight or just reiterate what Canada said. In the case of Cuba, we have just recently agreed on this KIP. So we're surprised, having just agreed to this and having just agreed to servicing sector guidelines, that we now appear to have a request to change those agreements. And to be clear, when we negotiated the servicing sector guidelines, we had extensive discussions about exactly these issues, and we made specific changes and accommodations both to the amounts of compensation, which are much, much higher for LVCs as compared to what we provided in the case of HCFCs, much higher. But in particular, at the request of Cuba, we changed the categorization of the LVCs to accommodate their concerns. So I get back to the question of, we've heard these concerns, we've made multiple efforts to accommodate them, and now there appears to be an effort to reopen those agreements in the context where, as Canada said, Cuba's KIP explicitly says they can come back in with investment projects in the RAC sector. So there is also a mechanism within that KIP to seek additional funding. So from our perspective, again, we're happy to have discussions with Cuba and the other countries about these issues. We want them to be data-driven. We want those discussions to not reopen the very agreements that we've come to over the last year and a half to try to accommodate the concerns that have been raised. We've tried to be reasonably flexible about this, to find solutions that can help those countries stay in compliance or get back in compliance. But we don't really see anything in here that to us then is new or different than the very discussion we had last year that led to Decision 3516, that led us to approve a KIP, that led us to agree to servicing sector guidelines in the multilateral fund, and that led us, in Cuba's case, to provide an opening for additional investment projects. So happy to have further discussions on this, but I do just want to be clear, we have taken a number of measures to try to address this concern, and we're not supportive of reopening servicing sector guidelines or reopening these prior agreements that have attempted to accommodate these requests. Thank you.
Thank you. I have Australia, EU, Cuba, and Japan on my list. So first, Australia.
Thank you very much, Co-Chair, and good afternoon to everyone. Thank you to Cuba for bringing its proposal to us for further consideration. We would like to align ourselves with the views expressed both by Canada and the US on this issue. We are of the view that the remedy already provided through MOP Decision 3516 is sufficient to assist those countries whose baselines were negatively affected and unexpectedly lower as a result of the COVID pandemic. Those countries, those 8 countries identified in Decision 3516 have been given a compliance deferral for 2 years. And in agreeing that decision, the issue of additional funding was considered last year, and it was not agreed to go ahead with additional funding. It was agreed that, in fact, the way forward would be for those countries to seek to put their KIPs in place as soon as possible, and those countries were urged to do so. And we note that 3 countries already have the KIPs in place, including Cuba. In the case of the Cuba Kigali implementation plan, as Canada and the US have indicated, it has the flexibility to submit additional RAC investment projects through the course of its Stage 1 KIP. It also has received additional funding for energy efficiency activities while phasing down HFCs. So there has been quite a lot of flexibility shown already by the Executive Committee in relation to assisting Cuba in meeting as much as possible its obligations under the protocol, and even the meeting of parties has allowed those obligations to be set aside for 2 years while it gets its KIP in place and manages its imports. As the US indicated, policy measures are critical for all countries to meet their obligations. We all have them in place already. All countries should be moving forward quickly to put those obligations in place, not just for the bulk refrigerant, but in looking at how they might manage their future servicing liability by putting forward, by including in their regulatory regime controls on equipment containing HFCs. This delegation is doing that, has already done that for some classes of equipment. We're looking at doing that for other classes of equipment in the future as well, because we also potentially are looking at our situation in the future being very tight in relation to our baseline, and we are trying to do what we can now to manage that through controls of equipment and thereby leading to lower servicing demand. So we also particularly want to note that, as Canada indicated, we only agreed the servicing sector guidelines for KIPs last year, and that in fact many countries have already come forward with servicing sector KIPs as a result of that, and we have many more coming forward this year for approval, and it does seem a little bit unusual for us to, less than a year out, be seeking to adjust those guidelines already when really they have only just been put in place. So we are also not inclined to revisit the remedies and the support that we have already provided. We certainly know that the decision that was taken last year does not prevent other countries from seeking additional remedy if they put forward their data, as the delegation from the US did, and it also does not preclude countries who may continue to have difficulties from seeking a compliance deferral in future years as well, if that is deemed necessary. So we would like to, I guess we have expressed our view, and we are not seeking to make any changes to the regime that we have put in place already. Thank you.
Thank you, Australia. And I was saying EU, but this time it's Hungary. But Hungary, please, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. So it's Hungary on behalf of the EU and the 27 member states. I will not add much to what the 3 previous speakers has already stated now. We too are not really open to revisit the decisions that have been taken quite recently, and we would like first to also give the opportunity to those decisions to take all those effects before maybe starting to reevaluate them if it could be necessary. So in order to make this intervention maybe short, and also in order to prevent your nervous system, because I'm guessing you're quite following the match, maybe for the time being, I just would like to associate myself to those three speakers. Thank you very much.
I'm concentrated on here, not following the wedge, definitely not. I have then Cuba on my list and then Japan.
Muchas gracias, señor copresidente. Realmente.
Thank you, Co-Chair. In fact, when we were speaking of the KIP and all that was decided during the 35th MOP, then that's for the refrigeration sector, which is been significantly in decrease because of the COVID-19 pandemic. And so the HFCs have become an issue, and this is why we spoke about these issues. This is where we have the largest consumption of the HFCs, as the graphic had showed. And unfortunately, the usual procedure was not followed, but the graph that was shown shows that we have not achieved a 10% reduction. We don't have to go 10%, we have to reduce by 42%. Well, very well, we will wait 2 years, and in 2 years we will see what the trends will be. Even if we establish a licensing system, a quota system, these substances are already in our country, and we must ensure that the equipment is being maintained with such substances, because we can't immediately change technology from one day to another. That's the reality in our country. And there is a trend currently of HFCs 23 increasing. We want to make sure that in 2024 it's the same level. And this is almost the same level as it was during the pandemic. If there hadn't been a pandemic, we would not be bringing this problem to the group, because imports in 2018 and 2019 were very similar to the 2023 imports. So there was a pandemic, there was a significant decrease in imports, and so now we are forced to ask for additional financing. Yes, there is a KIP, but it has to do with refrigeration. And that is why we're speaking about the possibility of a project to be implemented in the sphere where there is the greatest consumption, and that is where we could actually see some reductions. So if we need to reach 42% in our reductions, then according to the graph that I presented, possibly in 2 years we will reach this goal. But what is of concern for me is the fact that we want to respect our obligations under the Montreal Protocol. But in our view, it'll be extremely difficult for us. And this due to the conditions that we're facing in Cuba. We, of course, would like to adopt some lower gas substances. We want to reduce HFCs, but we are facing our economic reality here, a reality that we must accept. And that is why we are asking the MOP to create a financing window so that we would be able to respect our obligations under the protocol. Thank you.
Thank you. And then I have Japan on my list.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. Just to utter a voice quickly, in line with the interventions already made by the distinguished delegates of Canada, the US, Australia, and the EU, as we believe that this issue has already been addressed with reasonable flexibilities to accommodate the needs and challenges faced by those countries seriously affected by the coronavirus pandemic. While we are very sympathetic to Cuba, we are not very comfortable at this point reopening the discussion, especially when there's still rooms to be explored for Cuba to receive financial assistance from MLF without any additional decisions. Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair.
Thank you. And the list is exhausted. So is there anybody else who would like to speak now? If not, then I will consult for a moment how we proceed. Thank you. We consulted among each other and let's see, we heard quite some very differing views. First, I would start procedurally. It's CRP 8 is uploaded, and also the PowerPoint that was seen on the screen is now available as an INF, will be available as an INF document. So we heard quite some different views, and we also know that last year at the MOP there was an important decision taken, 35/16, and there all the available information was looked at, and the decision was very carefully drafted, and also the annex of countries that could be part of that decision. There was a thorough process of looking at, let's say, if the countries could be in the annex or not. We also heard new proposals, which are, let's say, coming forward from Cuba. And we would suggest that there would be informal consultations in the margins, in the corridors, to clarify certain aspects. Because it's also clear that there are let's say some countries spoke and there were some different aspects connected to, let's say, also the decision of 35/16. So our proposal is to have in the margins, in the corridors, informal consultations, and then Cuba could come back on how to proceed further. So that's our proposal for this agenda item. So we keep it open, but informal consultations in the margins of this meeting. I'm looking. So if that's the case, everybody agrees, then we can go further to agenda item. That's the last one, I guess, one of the last ones, 13 other matters. One moment. Under 13, when we adopted the agenda, Kyrgyzstan put forward a proposal, a CRP, which already has been on the portal. So I clearly would like Kyrgyzstan to present their CRP.
This is a CRP that has been published on the web portal on behalf of Kyrgyzstan. This is a document which was secured the support of a number of countries in our region, and Caucasus and Central Asia, as well as a number of countries in the region. So this document is open for submission on behalf of a group of countries. I would like to state that all countries are now beginning to implement the KIP projects, where the energy efficiency in the refrigerants equipment sector is covered by these KIP projects as part of a state strategy on refrigerants and the implementation of the Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol. The country is developing minimum energy efficiency strategies, which are viewed by us as a part of the necessary measures to introduce energy-efficient technologies and equipment into the sector of refrigerants and related equipment. The Ozone Secretariat has, over the last year and the previous year, conducted seminars on energy efficiency. We are very grateful to the Secretariat for these initiatives. Our country continues to carry out necessary measures to regulate the energy efficiency in the relevant sectors at the state level. As is well known, and today and during the side events, as was mentioned, the European Union in March of 2024 adopted an amendment number 573, on the introduction of more stringent requirements related to the HFCs and energy efficiency requirements, including a ban on the use and the repair of equipment and refrigerants of 8,500. And this document prohibits the export of obsolete HFC technologies, with certain exemptions that are introduced related to the possibility of Article 5 countries on the prohibition. This is a guideline from the European Union, which will have significant consequences for Article 5 countries. For when it comes to the Eurasian Economic Union, we have adopted a technical regulation requirement for energy efficiency and energy use, And this explicitly sets out restrictions on the import and on the use of energy inefficient products. The Republic of Kyrgyzstan last year adopted a state standard, and this explicitly sets out a requirement that the sector adopt only energy efficient projects in the higher classes of energy efficiency. And the question arises, how is it possible to inform the international community that a party does not wish to import energy inefficient products and new technical requirements on energy efficiencies? And in this way, conditions have emerged on the establishment of international mechanisms to prevent the illegal import of obsolete or energy inefficient products and equipment. But the main problem has to do with the fact that most countries, most Article 5 countries, do not have opportunities to create laboratories to assess the relevant energy classes in energy efficiency. So we have to rely on certain certifications on energy efficiency that are produced by manufacturers and exporters in countries of import for these products and equipment. The CRP proposes something which exists in the Energy Secretariat, the Ozone Secretariat, a mechanism to control and to prevent the illegal import of products and equipment which contain hydrochlorine. And I wish to remind colleagues of a decision during the 27th Conference of Parties in Dubai in 2013. And the proposal is for a mechanism to cover the governing of undesired import of energy inefficient products and equipment that do not meet national MEPS requirements, minimal energy efficiency standards. The Ozone Secretariat could establish on its website a list of states that do not wish to import energy inefficient products and equipment, and countries that produce or export refrigerants could then have licenses meet the exporting countries' requirements. And the document which has been brought to under your consideration to prevent the import of energy inefficient products. With this, we wish to note that the decision of the 27th Conference of Parties in Dubai provides for the establishment of a list of countries that do not produce for internal import and do not wish to import these products. We can leverage this existing practice. A number of countries have already introduced prohibitions on energy inefficient products and equipment, and these countries, if they wish to do so, could, and I stress this, voluntarily inform export countries about this with the use of mechanisms which already exist under the Montreal Protocol, including that is the Ozone Secretariat. So this has a request for the Secretariat to have a list of countries that do not wish to import energy inefficient products and equipment, including countries which the export countries could use to govern trade in equipment. On the basis of existing practice of the Ozone Secretariat, the procedure for notification on energy inefficient products, on the basis of this, a new mechanism for governing the trade in energy inefficient products will help to make countries make headway in reducing the production of low classes of efficiencies and related products, and thereby contribute to the achievement of the implementation of the Kigali Agreement. To conclude, we wish to note that the CRP is not related to preventing technological dumping or the problem of illegal trade in HFCs or related products. This is more to do with the introduction of energy efficient technologies into our country's economies. The CRP also does not have any calls or requirements for any countries to restrict trade. This has only 2 paragraphs. The first, the parties of the Montreal Protocol are proposed on a voluntary basis to inform the Secretariat that they do not consent to the importation of such products. And Para 2 requests the Secretariat to maintain a list of parties on a special list on the website of the Secretariat so that importers and exporters have an opportunity to check their data in the export procedures. We do not object to the countries implementing the preamble or introducing other paragraphs in the operative part of this. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Kyrgyzstan, for introducing your CRP. And I would like to open the floor for reactions on this CRP. The list is still empty. I don't see any party requesting for the floor. Is that correct? I just check it. United States.
Thank you very much, Mr. Co-Chair. Sorry, we were not sure if someone else was going to go in, but we are happy to break the ice on the discussion on the decision, the draft decision in the CRP that was put forward. We appreciate the points being raised about asking the Secretariat to maintain a list, and we will note that the Secretariat in the past couple of years where we've had conversation about products containing, the Secretariat has put forward on the website a list, and we were looking back at the decisions, and it's quite possible that we may need to think about whether or not this should be an ongoing opportunity for parties to update the Secretariat on products that contain a controlled substance that are not permitted to be imported into that country. So for example, the United States, and we noted this in an intervention earlier, the United States has now established regulatory domestic bans on the import as well as the domestic manufacturing and export of certain products, and has established a global warming potential level for those. And therefore, the information that's currently on the Secretariat's website is somewhat dated in our case, and we would like to update that. So we would perhaps suggest that another path forward, and perhaps we can look at this decision and make suggestions on how to perhaps improve it, would be to look at the existing list that the Secretariat maintains for controlled substances and products that are in controlled substances and parties that have regulatory provisions in place that prevent those appliances from being imported into their country. Perhaps there is a way to instead ask the Secretariat to, on an ongoing basis, update that existing list rather than create another list. That would be our thinking right now, but we would like to take a look at this decision further, and we're happy to consult in the margins about some suggestions on how we could look at the existing requirements and perhaps find a path forward that is cognizant of what is the obligations under the protocol, and making sure that something we put forward is consistent with that. So we would probably suggest the focus be on products that contain a controlled substance, for example. But there is language from the decisions that we've took both last year and the year before that we think are probably aligned with the intent, and we may be able to find a path forward to simply ask that that list be updated on some sort of regular basis. Thank you.
Thank you, and also thank you for breaking the ice. I have Canada on my list. Canada.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. We'd like to thank the delegation of Kyrgyzstan for this proposal. While Canada is not opposed to consider the issue, and as the delegate from the United States mentioned, I think we're open to have a discussion on this. But we would like to better understand the rationale behind the proposal. Given, and I understand that the delegate from Kyrgyzstan provided some explanation during his intervention, sort of separating out this request being different than illegal trade. But we have had discussions over the past couple of years on the import and export of prohibited energy inefficient cooling equipment that led to decision 3513, which requests the Executive Committee of the Multilateral Fund to consider allocating funding within KIPs and HPMPs for assisting A5 parties to develop and enforce policies and measures that will prevent future noncompliance. And the decision also urges parties exporting such equipment to consider instituting measures to prohibit, as appropriate, the export of cooling equipment relying on controlled substances that is no longer permitted to be placed on the market in the exporting parties. And, we recall that during those discussions, there was discussion about preparing such a list, which at the time was not taken up. However, as mentioned, we are open to discuss, and I think the ideas put forward by the delegate from the United States might be an interesting solution to consider. So we're happy to engage on those discussions. Thank you.
Thank you. I have Kuwait on my list, and then Ghana, and almost had 2 times Ghana. So I have Kuwait, Ghana, and others who would like to speak. Please indicate that you would like to speak. First, Kuwait.
Thank you very much, Mr. Co-Chair, and I would like to thank the distinguished delegate from Kyrgyzstan for submitting his issue, and as I'm sympathize with what he present and explain, and I will also echo my voice with the distinguished delegate from Canada and USA that we are willing to go in this negotiation, and with understanding of that, as the distinguished delegate from Canada mentioned it very clearly, that there is a certain talk we should have about countries which allowing exportation for less energy efficiency than it's in their domestic use. So there is a place there where we can talk about and also give a chance to better understand from our colleagues who have this issue how they will looking forward to face it and how to solve this issue. So we are also available if any negotiation or discussion about this issue. Thank you.
Thank you. Good to know. I have Russian Federation on my list and the EU. So if others would like to speak up, please indicate. I have Russian Federation, EU, Armenia. Are there others who would like to speak? That's not, then I would like to close the list. Russian Federation, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Co-Chair. In our view, this is a very natural desire on the part of a country to have a unique instrument in this form, in the form of a list to be maintained by the Secretariat, and this list would simply have a listing of countries, of parties that announce to the whole world that they do not consent to the importation of products and equipment that is not in line with their requirements. In our view, this does not require any resources, does not require any financial resources, does not require any other resources. Of course, there are other lists that delegates mentioned, but as we see it, having this kind of a separate list, a list where any party can state their views, is a very good idea, and we think that this is a very sound instrument, and we support this, and we think that it's even odd to us to hear objections to this. Perhaps it seems this is a good idea and it should be supported. Thank you.
Thank you. So when I closed the list before that, I had 1 or 2 times Ghana. I just want to check if Ghana still would like to take the floor, or that was a mistake by the button. Okay, you are appearing back again, so you would like to have the floor. So then I would like to ask Ghana first, and then the EU, and then Armenia. Because I think there was something going wrong with pushing the button. Ghana, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Co-Chair. And since Ghana is taking the floor for the first time, we would like to add our voice to the tongues of appreciation and praise that have been heaped on the government of Canada and the Secretariat for ensuring a very smooth implementation of this meeting. Having said that, I will also want to thank the distinguished delegate from Kyrgyzstan for the proposal submitted. Indeed, I wish to express my sympathy for their pain. And I'll be interested in learning more about the situation, and will want to add my voice to the earlier speakers that this call for further discussions on the matter, and we will be very much interested in involving ourselves in further deliberation on this matter. Thank you very much, Co-Chair.
Thank you, Ghana. Then the EU.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. We would also like to thank the distinguished delegate of Kyrgyzstan for their explanation and their motivation behind their CRP. It was very clear. We are, of course, happy to engage to further discussions on this subject. We know that a reference was made to the new EU legislation concerning our export rules for certain equipment, so we'll be more than happy to provide the necessary clarifications in these discussions and see potential rewardings. Thank you.
Thank you. And then I would like to give the floor to Armenia, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Co-Chair. Taking the floor for the first time, I would like to express our appreciation on behalf of the Armenian delegation for all the wonderful preparation that the Secretariat has arranged, and to the Government of Canada for hosting us in this wonderful city of Montreal, be it in winter or summer times. It's equally enjoyable. Armenia overall supports the idea of having a list, maintaining a list of countries that do not wish to import energy inefficient equipment, and it can be done in one of the ways forward, either as a separate list or updating the existing list as proposed by the distinguished delegate of the US. And we are ready to be involved in the deliberations and discussions to contribute, but I believe we have to bear in mind that when we say energy inefficient, it may mean different things for various countries, so we have to be careful to be able to distinguish between the national limitations on what is considered energy efficient and energy inefficient. Thank you.
Thank you. I would like to have a moment to confer here behind the desk. After heard let's say the comments and suggestions made by the floor on the proposal for the CRP from Kyrgyzstan, we would like to suggest to establish a contact group, and that to put forward then the proposal, and to see if that can be let's say made into let's say something that's that takes care of all the ideas that were put forward, or maybe in another way. But that would be our proposal, to have a contact group, and time and place will be made available later on, and also the people who would co-facilitate that group. Is that an acceptable way forward? I don't see reactions that it's not an acceptable way forward, so let's do it like this. Then I would like to give one moment. So Miruza will take over now for CRPs.
Thank you, Rolf. And we will go back to agenda item 7 on MDIs. And we have CRP 6, and I would like to request one of the proponents to introduce this CRP. Oh, it's by EU. EU, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you, Madam Co-Chair. So we had a very good discussion yesterday on this topic, and a number of parties taking the floor and saying that they wanted more discussion on this. So we feel encouraged by that. We've also heard that new propellants from the TEEP, for instance, are about to be introduced to the market. In the EU, several manufacturers have announced that for the year 2025, and globally, TEEP tells us this would be 2026. So that's quite close to where we are now, a year or 2 years from now. So there's clearly ongoing developments where industry is moving forward, and there's an industry push going beyond the EU on this matter to introduce new propellants. So the question is for us how to support this introduction of low GWP MDIs, in particular because this being medicines, that the relevant approval processes that need to be well prepared are in place, and there is a role for the relevant authorities and companies in this. So we see that there's a need for more coordination between environmental authorities, medical authorities, industry, including global coordination, to make this transition as smooth as possible. So with this objective in mind, we have put forward this CRP. It's CRP 6 on the portal on measures to facilitate the transition to metered-dose inhalers with low global warming potential propellants or alternative products. And coming to the proposal itself of the draft CRP, it is rather concise, rather short. It has 2 preambles and 3 operative paragraphs. In the preambles, one refers back to the TEEP and the MACTOC on the great work they've done in the quadrennial report and the 2023 progress report. A second preamble notes that there is a number of alternatives to high GWP inhalers, and that also as a new development, there is now the availability of metered-dose inhalers with propellants with low global warming potential around the corner. As I said, 2025 market introduction in the EU. So on the operative paragraphs, paragraph 1 would ask for or promote a coordination between national environmental and health authorities to raise awareness on the impact of metered-dose inhaler propellants on climate and the environment with a view to promoting the use of alternatives, basically dry powder inhalers, soft mist inhalers, and also the new MDIs with low global warming potential, which require an effective approval process, so these could be timely approved and available. A second operative paragraph would ask parties to liaise with companies producing such new metered-dose inhalers in their countries with a view that these approval processes could be put in place and set up. Or rather that the companies would seek approval for metered-dose inhalers. And a third operative paragraph would be that the medical agencies in parties would reach out to their counterparts in other countries to facilitate the approval processes, because there is the way of data sharing, for instance, to facilitate that companies can make these applications without having to repeat costly experiments in order to prove the safety of these inhalers. So it is very much in total a call for more cooperation, both at the national level and internationally, in order that approval processes can be put in place and that the transition be as smooth as possible. As I said, it is ongoing and industry is moving forward, so we need to be prepared on our side. This is the CRP, and we'd be very happy to be given a contact group where we could do the further discussion that a number of parties asked for. Thank you very much.
Thank you, EU. And now I open the floor for discussion on this. And we have, on my list, I have Canada and India, and I give the floor to Canada first.
Thank you, Madam Co-Chair. So we'd like to thank the European Union for its proposal in CRP6. Since we had quite an in-depth discussion on this issue yesterday, while we have significant comments on the proposal, perhaps I could just say that we would support to have a group to discuss it rather than enter into the details now in plenary. But if there is such a group that is set up, we hope that it could also consider other issues that our delegation raised yesterday in relation to the report by the TEEP, both the 2024 progress report and the quadrennial assessment of the MCTOC, where there were a number of issues that were raised that we thought would also be important to address. So just to say that, with this in mind, we would support a group to consider this proposal. Thank you.
Okay, Canada, and now I give the floor to India.
Thank you, Madam Co-Chair. We would like to thank the European Union for the CRP. Madam Co-Chair, this delegation expressed its views on this issue yesterday under agenda item number 10, agenda item number 7, noting that the MDI is an important and critical sector dealing with the human health protection and also considering the challenges on the penetration of the said alternatives, especially in the Article 5 countries, including the technical feasibility and economical viability. We feel that there is no need for any decision on this issue at this stage. Thank you, Madam Co-Chair.
Thank you, India. And now I give the floor to Brazil.
Thank you very much, Madam Co-Chair. We just wanted to add our voice to the comments made by India. We are, of course, open to discuss this matter further on a contact group, but given the critical, the importance of this issue, and the difficulties faced by A5 parties into the accessibility and the technical difficulties into accessing the alternatives presented, and also the fact that some of the alternatives will only begin to be available on 2025, it might be a bit premature to have a decision at this stage. We are in favor of continuing this discussion, bearing in mind that countries may have different approaches to how they will face the replacement of metered dose inhalers. This might not be the priority now for many countries, as there are other products that are less critical that could be replaced. We, again, are open for discussing this issue in a contact group, but we may feel that it might not be the time for having a decision that addresses this issue as proposed by the distinguished delegates from the European Union. Thank you.
Thank you, Brazil. And now on my list, I have United States, Switzerland, and Tunisia. And I would like to urge those who would like to take the floor to do so now. And now I would like to give the floor to United States.
Thank you very much, Madam Co-Chair. And like many of the prior speakers, I'll also note that we raised our concerns yesterday, and I don't feel the need for us to have to restate those as we spoke of them quite extensively. We appreciate the European Union did put forth this CRP, but as we noted yesterday, many of the concepts in here we do think are premature at this stage. We're happy to participate in a group if there is a group, but we'd also encourage you to consider whether or not this could be discussed on the margins, just given the fact that at this stage it seems like you have many contact groups, work and informal groups that you are trying to establish and find meetings for, and it sounds like thus far we have not heard very much that makes us feel like this is a decision for which at this meeting we're going to make much progress. But we are happy to engage in whatever way that you feel is appropriate. Thank you.
Thank you. And Switzerland, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Madam Co-Chair. As this delegation has mentioned yesterday, this is an issue we would like to keep on discussing, and it's an important one for this meeting and the meeting to come. And in this sense, we thank the European Union for the CRP and would welcome a contact group to discuss this matter further. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And now I have Tunisia and Russian Federation. And with this, I would like to end the list and would like to give the floor to Tunisia.
Thank you, Madam Co-Chair. I would like to thank the European Union for this CRP. Based on the data in the paper, it seems that these alternatives are available, and we call upon the parties to use such alternatives from 2025 onward, especially that the TOC involved, the MBTOC, refers to the availability of studies, and I hope that such studies would be final and this would contribute to the implementation of this paper.
Thank you. And
we would like to participate in this team. Thank you.
Thank you. And now I would like to give the floor to Russian Federation.
Thank you, Co-Chair. In our view, indeed, we have already spoken on this issue, that it's early to discuss this issue concretely, taking into account the fact that there isn't enough experience in using these alternatives. We would like to draw attention to the fact that MDIs are extremely difficult at times when, in terms of their effect on those suffering from asthma. So substances that have not been tested over the course of many years shouldn't necessarily be immediately recommended so that everyone drops everything and replaces their inhalers. It's early. It's too early to discuss this amongst the parties. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me consult with my co-chair and come back at the way forward. Thank you. Thank you, delegates. During the chief report, we also heard a lot of concerns from the parties, and therefore the proposal from the co-chairs is that we establish a contact group to discuss these further, and if that is fine with the parties. Since no objection from the floor, we will establish a contact group on this, and we will inform the time and venue later. And now we will return to agenda item 5 on atmospheric monitoring, and we also have a CRP on this agenda item, and therefore I would like to request one of the proponents to introduce this CRP to the plenary. Thank you.
Thank you, Co-Chair. I'm happy to introduce this CRP on behalf of my country and Canada. We, having heard the discussion in the plenary, as well as some of the initial discussions and the question and answer that we had in the contact group, we felt like, based on some of what we heard, we could try to put pen to paper to have a more concrete and specific discussion on how we carry this issue forward. I'll run through it briefly, paragraph by paragraph, but before I do, I just want to frame this a little bit because the issue is a little bit tricky. So the vision behind this decision is that actually we will need to take two decisions. We will need to take a MOP decision and a COP decision later this year, and the reason for that is that the general trust fund that I will refer to later was established under the Vienna Convention, and so just the decision is going to sound a little bit peculiar, but the reason for that is that we need to sort of bring these two jurisdictions together of the Montreal Protocol and the Vienna Convention to really take this issue on. So with that said, I think what you see in this decision implements what a number of countries, I think, have referred to as a staged approach. The first stage would be to sort of identify and evaluate potential monitoring locations, and then the second stage would be to look to move forward with implementing and financing the establishment of a limited number of such stations. So I will just run through paragraph by paragraph. So the first paragraph very simply requests the Ozone Secretariat, and actually this is perhaps an area of clarification to the Ozone Secretariat as to whether the request goes to the Ozone Secretariat or UNEP. But either way, the idea is that, again, for this first stage of identifying and evaluating potential monitoring locations, we're going to need some additional resources to do that. There's some overages in both the Montreal Protocol and Vienna Convention trust funds for the Secretariat. So we've left the amount blank here. We want to come to that after we hear back a little bit more from the SAP and possibly the Secretariat on some of the costs of this. But the idea here is just to transfer some of the overage from the Secretariats to the General Trust Fund under the Vienna Convention. The second paragraph simply requests the Ozone Secretariat to continue doing what they have been doing, supporting the work of the General Trust Fund by working to map possible locations for monitoring of controlled substances. And then moving on, the third paragraph I think is really a critical one. It's what I foreshadowed before. It is an invitation to the parties to the Vienna Convention to take a number of actions. And as I said, there would be a parallel Vienna Convention decision at the COP later this year. So what we think we need to do to operationalize this, which is basically to use the Vienna Convention General Trust Fund to support these stage 1 activities to identify and evaluate these monitoring sites. We need to do 4 different things that are outlined in this paragraph. The first would be to request the advisory committee of the General Trust Fund in evaluating these potential sites to take into consideration 5 different criteria, or 5 different aspects. These aspects are actually mentioned in the documents that the Secretariat has prepared for this meeting, but they relate first to the suitability of such sites for providing regionally representative data covering areas with substantial volumes of controlled substances. Second, quite importantly, is that the sites have the potential for a dedicated implementing partner. Thirdly, to consider whether existing infrastructure could be relied upon at such sites. And then fourth and fifth, to look at these issues of coordinating the calibration of data and ensuring the sharing of data between scientific monitoring locations. Moving on to paragraph 3b, we would also request the Vienna Convention to modify the terms of reference of the General Trust Fund to specifically add atmospheric monitoring of controlled substances as a purpose of the fund. So the General Trust Fund was established under the Vienna Convention. Its current primary focus is ozone monitoring. So we just need to make a minor change to also add atmospheric monitoring of controlled substances. Similarly, in paragraph C, we would therefore also need to modify the terms of reference of the advisory committee of the General Trust Fund. And basically the idea would be to allow them to invite additional experts who work on monitoring of controlled substances and have a subcommittee specifically dedicated to this aspect. And that's in addition. So the work would, of course, continue on traditionally what they've done, which is ozone monitoring, and add a specific focus on the monitoring of controlled substances. And then subparagraph D simply requests the advisory committee and thus the subcommittee to report on progress and/or any results to the 37th meeting of the parties. So those paragraphs in total are how we would suggest implementing this sort of stage 1 of identifying and evaluating potential monitoring sites. And then moving on to the second stage, that is really operationalized in paragraph 4, which requests the executive committee of the multilateral fund to consider a funding modality to support a limited number of pilot projects to enhance regional atmospheric monitoring of controlled substance, guided by the scientific advice of the General Trust Fund Advisory Committee that I outlined in the language for the first 3 paragraphs previously. And indeed, we would look for a report back from the Multilateral Fund at the 37th meeting of the parties on work undertaken to develop such a funding modality. So with that, Co-Chair, I realize this is a somewhat complex decision given the overlap between the Montreal Protocol and the Vienna Convention. That is, in fact, why we wanted to sort of put pen to paper so that we've been discussing this a little bit in the contact group, but I think seeing words on paper can hopefully help clarify some of the ideas that have been put forward in those discussions. We really welcome hearing from other countries here in the plenary on their reflections to these proposals, as well as discussing it further in the contact group. And if our colleagues from Canada who were co-sponsors would like to add anything else to our introduction, we of course would welcome that as well. Thank you, Co-Chair.
Thank you, United States, for introducing CRP 7. And we suggest that the discussions be continued in the contact group, but EU is asking for the floor. So,
thank you, Madam Co-Chair. It was simply to thank the US and Canada for this excellent initiative to put something on paper. We understood that it's a bit complex with the interplay between the meeting of the party and the conference of the party, but that's certainly technicalities we will discuss. We have already some points collected, which we are happy to discuss in the contact group, and thanks again for this initiative.
thank you, EU. And on my list, I have India, Australia, and Brazil, Kuwait. First, I give the floor to India.
Thank you, Madam Co-Chair. We would like to thank the US for introducing the CRP7. While we can discuss the elements of the CRP in the contact group already established, it is also important to have a discussion on the processes as well as the modalities, considering the involvement of Vienna Convention and the Multilateral Fund. We would be happy to discuss further in the contact group. Thank you, Madam Co-Chair.
Thank you, India. And now I give the floor to Australia.
Thank you very much, Co-Chair, and thank you very much to the United States and Canada for putting pen to paper on this very complex issue. And I think that is probably the hardest bit, is actually trying to frame our discussions, because they are so complex and they do cross not only the Montreal Protocol and the Vienna Convention, but they perhaps cross three trust funds and the multilateral fund as well. So there's a great deal of complexity there to try and sort out. We do see some of the elements that we raised in plenary reflected in the draft decision, and we very much like to thank the US and Canada for being able to reflect that. However, we are very open to hearing from other parties as well on their thoughts on the way forward, and are very interested to engage on this issue in a contact group. Thank you, Co-Chair.
Thank you, Australia. And I give the floor to Brazil.
Thank you very much, Co-Chair, and we would also like to thank the United States and Canada for putting forward this CRP. We also appreciate the fact that they've considered some of the elements that we also raised, such as the importance of evaluating existing infrastructure when assessing potential sites for suitability. We obviously are open to continuing discussing this matter on the contact group already established, and we also have some questions in relation to the amount of resources that will be transferred, and how much does that represent in terms of how much they represent in terms of the overall general trust fund resources, and also in relation to the governance, the trust fund, the MLF, also the advisory committee role, who should do what. And I do appreciate the efforts made by Canada and the US in putting this into paper because even though we have many questions, we believe that this is the best way that we can actually bring those discussions into the draft text. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I have on my list Kuwait and Norway. And is there any party who would like to take the floor now? If not, I will close the list and give the floor to Kuwait.
Thank you very much, Madam Co-Chair, and I would like also to thank USA and Canada for submitting this CRB and capturing a lot of the discussion happened yesterday and today in the morning. I think it was very hard and difficult for the distinguished delegate from USA and Canada to prepare this CRB and putting all the element of the trust funds and the committees that will run this show, and I think that this is a way forward for us to understand something written, and we work with a written text to finalize it, and I hope that within the contact group we can reach to a lot of clarification and agreement and to move this forward, as this is a very important issue to be adopted very soon as much, and I would like again to thank both Canada and USA for this proposal. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kuwait. And last on my list, Norway. You have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Co-Chair. And we also would like to thank the USA and Canada for putting forward this CRP. We are very supportive of many of the elements in the CRP. We think it's laying down a good way for going on with this first stage on identifying a location, appropriate location. In addition, we would also like to ensure that we have this opportunity to also lay down a way for having a discussion on the long-term ambition and strategy that we want to have as parties and have some clarity on where we want to go at the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Norway. And as you already know, that contact group has already been established on this. So we would like to request to continue the discussions in the contact group. And with that, I would like to hand over to my co-chair. Thank you.
Can you project the working groups, the contact groups already? Let's do that. Yeah. Thank you, Miruza. On the screen, you will find the schedule for the contact groups and the groups that are taking place tonight. So first of all, strengthening of Montreal Protocol institutions. And the ones who will be co-chairing that group is Jana Mosiskova from the Czech Republic and Chantal Wellington. Then the group on atmospheric monitoring, which was already established and met already earlier, will be. And then tomorrow morning, there will be the informal group on feedstocks with Michel Gauvin and Leslie Smith. So Michel from Canada and Leslie Smith from Grenada. So with this, I would like to conclude this meeting. So we have 2 groups tonight, and then in the morning, another one. And then we'll see you in plenary tomorrow at 10 o'clock. Have a good contact group meeting.